Okay, welcome everybody to the Protocol Town Hall, a periodic guest talk series focused on protocols and protocol research. In today's Researcher Salon, we will be speaking with Sam Chua about punk, folk, myth, and protocols. There's a link to the SOP forum in the YouTube chat. We'll host any conversation during the salon there, and in the YouTube chat, there's some readings of the week on the forum and other protocol musings there as well. You can find more Summer of Protocols research, the program calendar, along with more information about the protocol kit at www.summerofprotocols.com. And I'll bring our speaker on the screen now. This is Sam. Sam is a cultural entrepreneur and independent consultant based in Asia, and he is interested in all things where the soft meets the hard, the technical, and the social. Today he'll be talking about like I said, myth, folk, and protocol. So why don't you take it away, Sam?
Thanks. It's a mouthful. All right. Let's see. I hope my stuff is showing up. Can we see the screen, Timber?
Yep.
Yes. Good.
Yep. You're all good on the screen.
Okay. Cool. Great. Thanks. All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Sam, and the topic's a bit of a mouthful. It grew out of a few things, and we'll go through it stage by stage over the next, I think, 30, 40 minutes or so. So first, some quick introduction. I guess, like all of us, we're many things, but I guess for the purposes of this talk, I'm a protocol-curious Southeast Asian. I'm from Malaysia. I'm in Malaysia right now, but I've lived many parts. I've also used to work in roles doing research across the region. So we're thinking about the region and Southeast Asia, and also lived in different parts of the world. So kind of thinking a lot about questions that I think appeal to many of us. I was also a participant in the recent Datus and Nusas workshop, focusing on Southeast Asia, hosted by Summer of Protocols. So as Timber has mentioned, I'm a cultural entrepreneur and independent consultant. I've worked across different fields: innovation, strategy, design, research, futures, large multinationals based across East Asia, Southeast Asia, especially, but also with like a bit of a global and kind of especially future forward kind of lens. And my interests are broad, but I think the two themes that really are, I think, can draw a trend line through from like over like a decade or two ago are really about the questions of how societies learn and change, like how the new concepts turn into everyday culture. And one of the concepts that I keep coming back to is this idea of the working imagination, which is kind of the future version of working memory. If working memory is about what can we hold in our heads, the context window for LLMs, in a way, working imagination is about what are the different pieces, modules, arcs, and stories that we hold that allow us to begin acting upon, building, creating, into the now and the near future. So these are some of the themes in the background, and you'll see a bit of this emerge over the course of this talk. So there's going to be 4 parts to this talk, and the first one is going to be about the idea of punk. So punk has had a bit of buzz and resonance recently across a few different circles. I think those of you who are on the Summer Protocols forum will have seen some of the discussions. I hear there was discussions at Protocols Week around punk as well, and a few interesting threads, some blog posts, and all that, of course. And of course, like in Ethereum, there's this conversation around like like how we make Ethereum cypherpunk again, and what that entails. And more recently, I think maybe connected to some of the recent conversation, punk really emerged also in the Datus and Nusas workshop, in which we were exploring Southeast Asia, and it emerged that there's this, it's a region for which like the notion of punk has deep resonance with long history, culture, and traditions. I'll talk a bit more about that. But so punk isn't just some sort of copy and paste new thing that young Southeast Asian kids are picking up. There's actually a long tradition of histories and cultures in the region having elements of punk in them. So recently in the workshop and beyond, like we've started riffing on what we think of as regional varieties of punk. I think one of the first themes was this idea of seapunk, Southeast Asia's history has been a region where trade routes and connectivity were really much more significant than borders across much of the history. The seas, in a way, did more to connect than they did to separate. And it was a space of like exchange and a lot of interoperability. Like business would move from like one port to another port if the governments and empires change. Part of the way the British became quite successful in this was adopting a policy of free trade and therefore competing so that the business came to them. Right, it was less coercion initially and much more like attraction through that. So it was a region of traders, sojourners, people who would like move somewhere else to find a living and often keep moving around and like have a very different sense of attachment to place and home. Like pirates, controversial, but there's this depending on pirates is a function of perspective, but like definitely a sense of freedom on the seas and like kind of like finding your own way and having that sense of choice. And generally a sense of like fluid identities, right? So that was a very punk kind of world and tradition, like in the over like the centuries, like even predating like the modern and colonial era. And we also spoke a bit about this idea of ricepunk, one of the most prominent authors in Southeast Asian studies and I think culture and history more broadly is James C. Scott, and he's famously written things like Seeing Like a State. But he also wrote like a lot of his fieldwork was done actually in Southeast Asia, working especially with peasants and farmers, and like those were the inspiration for his work on the art of not being governed and weapons of the weak, which were really about this notion that you have in a sense people that are relatively powerless, but they still find a way to like discover agency and kind of like sort of get on even if they have limited capability, but like find a way to make it work. And this is kind of like will to live and will to adapt that's there. And of course, rice is a notoriously like labor intensive thing to plant, right? You can get really good yields, but you often need like I think what research has shown about maybe double the amount of labor per acre to do it. So like it requires like a lot of like kind of like social coordination and all that, both in terms of labor, but also especially in terms of sharing water. Some of the most iconic images of Southeast Asia are the like just fields of like rice fields with all the water systems required to do that, and a lot of like hills have been turned into terraces where like the water flows one to the other, and these are very sophisticated systems to build, but they're also really challenging systems to sustain from a governance perspective, right? Because if my field has more water than your field, then my rice does a lot better than your rice, and to sustain this kind of like coordination agreement and governance over many generations actually takes a lot of like coordination, and there's a kind of like almost like a sense of like agency and solidarity that are required to actually make that work. Some of these traditions survive till today. In Bali, you have systems like the subak system of managing water that still like are practiced till today. And I think those in a way are kind of like what part of the ricepunk idea was about, right? Can you actually have a way of like a bottom up kind of like agency and governance that allows for flourishing and coordination. So third, this is a bit more of a riff, was like the idea of forest punk. I think some of us were exploring like if there's like people of the seas, people of the fields, like that. Southeast Asia also famously has people of the highlands, the forest, Golden Triangle, and that and like many other parts of the world, like the mountains and the forests are often where like survivors, exiles, like resistances go, and there's an exploitation of the inaccessibility of the space as a feature. Like the mountains are high, the forests are thick, the emperor civilization power is far away, right? And this is kind of like refuge in the forest that gives you a sense of like autonomy and a way of like kind of like maybe preserving your way of life and your will even at a distance. So just a quick note, like this is not about reducing like cultures, Southeast Asian or otherwise, to punk and just saying this is all there is, but it's about recognizing that we found that in thinking about Southeast Asia, a lot of elements in there actually like have very punk elements, even though like, and especially the elements that in a way predate or come before the modern era. So that got us thinking a bit about what what is punk? What are some of the elements? So I'm just going to do some quick analysis on punk, and this is not punk as the aesthetic, but punk or the fashion, but really about punk as a literary genre, right? Like what kind of narratives and tropes does this punk have? And the first major kind of set of themes is this idea of like being non-heroic or even anti-heroic sometimes, right? Punk isn't really like this grand save the world heroes, the ones like really destined, born into greatness kind of thing. And there's also this aspect that if you think about like some of the famous punk works, like Blade Runner, of course, is the one of the iconic cyberpunk pieces. It's the world is as much a character as the actual parts of it, right? It's about kind of like really getting a sense of how this world works, its functions and dysfunctions. And one theme in punk is that like the idea of like greatness and grandeur, becoming king, is often not really like a goal, and is sometimes not even considered good or desirable, right? It's not a tale of like someone being born great for destiny, they take over and all that. It's really like an anti-heroic element to it. And the second set of elements that I want to highlight is the idea of asymmetric conflict. Punk is definitely like a conflict genre, like so it's drama. It's there can be elements of satire, but it's not really a comedic light kind of genre, right? I mean, there's a lightness about it, but it's not in the comedic kind of sense. And often the structure of punk is you have like small like indie kind of protagonists against institutional antagonists, and there's also an asymmetry to how seriously the conflict is taken, right? The punk often is like has this kind of like indifference to status and authority. They just want to do their thing, they want to get by, they want to survive, they want to like play their music, but for various reasons the institution actually needs them to like not do what they want to do, right? Because of maybe of preserving social order, or like rules need to be followed or something else. So there's this kind of asymmetric nature to it. And one other way of like thinking about what punk embodies is kind of like what is the opposite of punk, and apparently there's a sort of like term or genre, and like I dug this up on Wikipedia somewhere, right? About prep being like the opposite of punk, right? That actually I found really interesting, because there's this we of course have prep schools, where you have like the elite, like the insiders, the chosen ones, who are destined for great things. They're schooled for success. They're prepared. They're trained to kind of like take on the institutional like reins and kind of like continue governance and all those things. And punk, of course, is like many ways the opposite of that, right? The heroes of punk are the like they're outsiders, they're everymen. What's destiny, right? These are not people that were born destined for, at least not consciously, for that. If anything, they're inadvertent, reluctant heroes. It's about a school of real life and hard knocks, and instead of being institutional, they are very much like alienated, at least in the premise and the setting of it. So putting all these together, I think the theme that emerges is that like the idea of punk is really about the small versus the system. And if we go a bit meta, right, part of the implicit message in like why do we tell punk stories, right? I think there's an implicit hope or what if that like the system doesn't have to be this way, right? It could be more hospitable, like in the story of like of a Blade Runner. It's about sure it's the great like crazy city, chaotic and all that, and like people trying to cope within there, right? But there's also like a question I think that's raised, which is the systems have to be like that, right? And do they have to be so maybe indifferent or inhospitable to the small subjective experience? In another way, punk is really about the idea of like, can there be technology without technocracy? Can we have like different changes, progress, tools, coordination, but without like maybe the systems of authority, power, and governance that sometimes like feel like inevitable or attached or required for those. If we riff on this a little bit, is it possible to have roads without rulers? We remember so many empires in history through the infrastructure they built, the roads of the Roman Empire and all those things. And indeed, one of the justifications or legitimations of conquerors and rulers is that without us there would be no public infrastructure. And then And there's also the possibility of governance without governments. And I think in the wave of protocols research and the blockchain era that we're seeing, I think a lot of these questions have been brought freshly to the forefront. And I think that's partly why punk has become so resonant today. So that was part one about the idea of punk. We'll now go to part two, which is kind of sort of zooming out from punk a little bit and looking at I would say, adjacent or maybe slightly overlapping spaces of punk, folk, and myth. And this story really comes out of some of the quest of the Datus and Nusas workshop, which was there was this kind of search for, is there a way to protocolize this what Venkat calls the cultural hyperobject of Nusantara, right? There's this big nebulous region, but at the same time that feels to have some interesting and widespread characteristics. And then is there a protocol kind of lens or approach to that, right? So we looked at a lot of different folklore and myth, histories, customs of the region. So it wasn't all just punk as we explored that. And I'll just highlight a few quick examples to give you a sense for some of the themes and conversations that came out of that. This talk isn't just focused on Southeast Asia and what came out of that, but I think it's useful flavor. So we have themes like the mouse deer. The mouse deer is quite a common sort of protagonist or sort of small hero in a lot of the lore of the Malay world. It's a small deer, as you might gather from the name, that's renowned for being quite intelligent and cunning and at the same time friendly. So it's not a scheming kind of thing, but it's a mouse deer that is whose wits allow it to thrive against sometimes bigger threats or enemies, right? So the mouse deer can thwart the crocodile or the tiger by virtue of being smart and agile and savvy. So that's a very common trope in this region. We also have stories of sea peoples and a sense of what borders are almost lateral or irrelevant to them, and the idea of belonging not to land but to the sea, and a very different sense of what it means to what does government mean, what does citizenship mean to these people, has a lot of different perspectives. One of the lines that sticks with me a bit from the workshop is this quote. I think and I think it's one of the sort of commentaries around I think partly following the influence of Islam in this region, that even hell is not forever, and this is kind of impermanence, non-seriousness. It's quite opposed to the grand, if you think about the Western Christian narrative of what you do in your life determines are you in heaven forever or hell forever, and everything has a weight and seriousness and a moral kind of critical mass that's there, right? And then here you get these kinds of ideas, right? That there's a lightness to it. Of course, this is not all of everyone, and it's a complex region with many different people, right? But it's an idea that's kind of that I think captures and resonates with some of the sensibilities in this part of the world. A couple more things. The idea of merantau or sojourning, and it's the idea of really I'm from place A, but to make a living, I will go around and could be so it's kind of a nomadism, but still having a belonging, right? And this is a very common kind of theme, right? Growing up in Malaysia, a lot of the first Indonesians you encounter are Indonesians who are merantau, who are coming searching for different opportunities, in different sectors. They could be maybe working in construction or other things. There's a lot of research on migrant labor across Asia and Southeast Asia and the world. So those kinds of themes are also very very embedded in the fabric. And then spirits and ghosts are anyone who spends some time in Southeast Asia and all that. You realize how much these just kind of are everywhere, both in literature, but also it's very common for them to be mentioned in normal conversations and everyday life, even in political life. There's every time there's a major event and stuff, it's not uncommon for many Southeast Asian politicians and governments to engage with some coconuts or what you might call a witch doctor and other things to engage with some of that. And that's kind of a presence of these in public life that's maybe a bit more interesting than other regions. So there's a lot of interesting stuff here, right? And so in the course of the workshop, we found that there's actually like this, like putting folklore and myth and all these histories and stuff together. Like there was a kind of a sense of like you kind of feel like like the region or the person if you anthropomorphize it a little bit. But when we came to the question of like, can we protocolize this, and like how do we boil it down? There was resistance, and I think that part of this could be that like maybe it takes work, it's hard, it's not intuitive, right? But there was also something about the sensibility of the region almost felt like it would be betrayed by trying to like boil it down and reduce it to a protocol. And like in following the workshop, I think I've spent a lot of time thinking about why is this? Like, what is there something about the region? Is it just we have to learn how to protocolize things better? We have to apply more rigor, or is there something else? And that leads us into the third part of this talk, which is like the idea of like the social imagination, and like like how do we begin to make sense of that? Can we sketch out and map out this kind of space? And I want to kind of introduce this by kind of raising the question, like what are the physics of a dream? It's I remember waking up like some months ago, and trying to just unpack and write down a dream. And of course, when you're freshly in a dream, you write it down, or you try to write it down. It feels so vivid. It feels really like it often feels moving. There's things you remember and like things that you want to write down, and then when you try and write it down and like boil it down and structure it out, then you realize that actually kind of collapses. The logic doesn't hold together. There's this scene in the movie Inception where I think it's Ariadne holding up the dream space, and then like the moment someone gets too close or something, maybe you hear the song or whatever, and then the space begins to like kind of fall apart, right? But that kind of fragility and of the dream actually doesn't really undermine what a dream does really well, right? Which is that it gives you it gives you like stories, it gives you like emotion, it gives you like maybe like a sense of like relating things, even if the internal logic of it is like that, right? It reminds me a bit of there's sometimes there's video games in which things have to become hyper real, or if you think about caricature, where like a caricature of a person is actually depends on very exaggerated features of that person's face, and if you compare it to a photograph, right, a caricature is really a failure at being an accurate representation in a photographic sense. But in a psychological memorability and recognition sense, the caricature actually works better, right? And I think this is kind of like exaggerated reality aspect of dream space that was reminded of, right? And if we take this framework and say like, what if these physics also apply to the space of like punk, myth, and folklore, right? Could story space like we do fiction because it's subject to different constraints, lack of constraints perhaps, and could some of these elements actually allow us to like look at these differently, and maybe what does that mean for thinking about protocolization, and is like a light or kind of like a dream native type of protocolization that can better support this. So what this led to was the idea that instead of being an overlapping Venn diagram, right, maybe it's different layers, right, that each have different logics and physics of their own, and maybe this is what makes it difficult to kind of do the translation from the realm of like story and character to the realm of like protocols. And I've begun to think of this as the socio-imaginational space, or the socio-imaginational layer, right? It's the realm of like punk, folk and myth, and of course, like it's about like a dream. It's about metaphor, allegory, heuristics, archetypes, memes and narrative, games and the hyperreal. It also reminds me of there's been a lot of interesting research and writing about the space of like indigenous thinking and other things, and there was a book Sentalk that I think also tries to capture you can't quite collapse it, but there's a lot of like rich like knowledge and relationships embedded within there. And I want to contrast distinguish the social imaginational from the sociological, right? So sociology is a field, it's been around for a long time, but it's very much about the behaviors observed from the outside, right? What do people do? Like how do the systems operate? And the social imagination is much more about what are the stories they tell themselves from the inside. This is more the space of, if this is the space of the census in the survey, this is the space of the novel and the memoirs. So it also got me thinking about a few other themes in art and culture that maybe like help us to illuminate the character of social imaginational space. Picasso famously said that art is a lie that makes us realize the truth. Right? We know the painting isn't the object, but sometimes the painting brings out aspects of the object that realize and maybe an inner structure. Right? Like a lot of his art and like many other artists have been about seeing things that are not that are implicit but maybe not obvious. And the idea of art is a bit also like the word parable, which is the word parable comes from the same root as the word parabola, which is you're curving around something and you're not going straight to it, and that gives you different kinds of explanatory and insight potential. It also made me think of oral versus written cultures. Right, there's an element to which oral cultures are actually generated in response to who's listening, right? So it's up until actually not too long ago, right? Maybe a couple decades, there were professional storytellers you could go to. Maybe this is before the age of mass scale entertainment, and they would kind of tell stories for hours, and a lot of times people would donate and all that, the same way that people bask with music today. And the oral tradition is really about you kind of doing procedural generation for a story, for a world, in a real-time narrative experience, and it's very adapted to the context. And the memory code base that it draws from isn't really rigorously protocolized in a linear kind of way, right? It's almost this dream world of stuff that you can kind of create something based off, right? And of course, for writing, the nature of writing requires a very different kind of logic, right? You have to create this kind of the final version for publication, right? What's the canonical version? And of course, a lot of scholars over the past millennia have been arguing about what's canonical, comparing different versions that don't quite match up, especially when translation is involved, right? But the idea of the ideal of written culture is to have something that kind of endures and remains the same across context. The article I write, so you lose a lot of that adaptivity and kind of context responsiveness in this transition. And one other thing that also jumped up was the idea of two different kind of sort of stories of shadow and different responses to it, right? So on the left we have the Platonic allegory of the cave, and the point of Plato's story was that it's if this is reality, then can we wake up and begin to see the reality? We should strive to see the real world, right? And I think this is part of the spirit behind the modern science and logic and modernity, which is about let's kind of move past the old illusions and go for the idea of truth and what's real, right? But here in Southeast Asia, the tradition, this is a shadow puppet picture. It's almost this other thing where shadows are actually a way of telling something that's true in a deeper way, right? And there's this sense of how all of life, all of the world is actually shadows in some way, and there's an embrace of these shadows. So it's sure that there may be like some platonic reality, but if it's shadows, it's all the way up, down, and around. Why don't you embrace that and play with it, right? So taking on a new, for example, identity or polity is kind of just taking on a different role play, right? So LARPing is in a way a lot closer to real life, and it's layers and layers of LARPing and shadows as a kind of sensibility around this. And of course, we live in the age of generative AI, and I think one of the things AI is doing is really surfacing to us this a different kind of computer and logic, right? A traditional algorithm driven interaction would require programming logic, but in LLMs we're starting to see hallucinations and probabilistic type stuff, right? And so in an LLM, a large language model, you read a lot of stuff, the AI digests a gazillion pieces of text and other things, it forms connections and encodes it in some sort of multiple dimensional kind of matrix, and out of this space you actually can generate a lot of interesting probabilistic responses, right? To a far higher level of success than previous iterations of AIs were able to. And that began to make me think of in some ways this kind of thinking of logic, of sense making, this kind of dream space, if you like, for an AI is actually very analogous to like the body of like what I think of as organic folklore, right? So not lore that you lore craft for like a new organization to try and get people to like work in certain ways and have certain like missions, visions, values, and that kind of thing. But if you think about the organic folklore that's evolved over like millennia, people adapting to the environments, sometimes you call it indigenous, like maybe wisdom, right? It's actually a large lived experience model, an LLXM, if you like, where like collectively over culture, people live and experience lots of different things. They learn a lot of real stuff, like maybe it's wisdom, depending on how adapted it is and how stable that is, right? And then it's hard to like write all of that down, right? Like, I mean, a lot of these cultures predate writing, and so like they are encoded as tales, as myths, as like taboos and all that into the realm of like of folklore, right? And like kind of like how an AI works, like this code base or this dream base, it is used to generate like responses and guidances for life, right? Of course, sometimes they're not very direct. If you read a bunch of stories about a mouse deer, like what does that tell you for it, right? It requires a different kind of reading or scrutiny, but like there's some analogies here that maybe this is an interesting like a metaphor for us to make sense of this layer, right? So all of this, it's still wrapping head around. I don't think it's a full theory of these things yet, but I think there's a sense of this distinct layer of the social imagination, the socioimaginational, that I think is worth understanding and unpacking on its own terms, right? And then like like what sort of like shadows does that cast onto like other layers, and how do we draw connections that are richer? And I think it also raises the question, which sticks with me, is maybe part of the reluctance to over protocolize like something like Nusantara was really about like the sense of like what learnings and logic and richness do we risk losing if we try and force fit one layer to another that are based on very different kind of almost like it's almost like going from a bitmap to a vector format. You have a very different kind of like compression and encoding that maybe loses a lot of the value and meaning that one layer is for in the first place. And so that brings us to the fourth part, and I guess especially it's a sum of protocols group and talk. What does all this? What might all this mean for us who are protocol curious? We're trying to think about, understand, and maybe design and build protocols that make sense. And the first kind of like idea I like to offer is the idea of the protocol punk proliferation cycle. And there's the meme around it's not a meme, it's actually a quote from an author about like how hard times create strong men create good times create weak men, and then weak men create hard times. And this is kind of like cycle of history type of theory, right? And it strikes me that there's actually a very like a similar potential dynamic between protocols and punks, right? When you have systems and protocols that suck, I think like Nadia's done research on dangerous protocols, and this idea of like we're all familiar with like Kafkaesque bureaucracies and things like that. And when a system is like really inhospitable to the small, then like you create an environment that just encourages like everyone to kind of punk in a certain way, right? You get people like who just like flout the rules, or they protocol tai chi it, and they get around it, right? And it kind of breeds a sensibility of like like a very like punk protocolist. And of course, if they in they are trying to get what they want to do done, they create new things. Like maybe they create good protocols, maybe they develop systems like new kinds of coordination systems and stuff that allow you to be good protocols. And the whole what's a good protocol is a different set of research and talks. I wouldn't go there, right? But if you grow up spoiled by good protocols and healthy institutions, then like there's a tendency to then like you have like what you might think of as prep protocolists, right? Where I've inherited a really good system, all I have to do is just perpetuate it, and the law can be bad. And there's this sense of the system works, and I just have to follow those rules. And that thinking can dangerously lead easily to, I'm just going to like if the bureaucracy knows best, if the institution knows best, then I just make protocols following it without maybe a strong sense of empathy or connection for how is this going to affect different parts of the system. And then that leads me back to dangerous protocols, and then the cycles continue. And maybe part of the question I like to leave with us is some of protocols, the mission is really about like making this a science, protocol literacy. If we understand protocols in a richer way, could we actually break the cycle and avoid this tendency, and maybe like this is what the challenge of all succession in kingdoms and successful golden ages are, right? Which is, how do you make the next set of administrators and princes not complacent, but actually understand some of the rigor and logic by which good protocols exist, and maybe history is going to doom us to a cycle again, but what sort of defenses or literacies can be built to actually try and keep things more in this half of the space versus this half of the space. The second thought I'd like to leave us with is the idea of is induction without reduction possible? And if you're thinking about how do we take lessons from all the rich things we can learn from culture and lore and accumulated wisdom, and think about what of that can be protocolizable, I think appreciating the different nature of the space, how can we learn as much as that's rich but without diluting or reducing it, right? How do we learn from lore and from dreams and other things without logical collapse? And it makes me think of I think it's closer to things like pattern languages from architecture and software, thinking about arcs and archetypes. So a different set of almost models and languages for it. I spoke a bit about bitmaps versus vectors, and being able to think and translate across different kinds of structures. And lastly, I think there's a kind of almost like a non-seriousness, holding both layers at the same time without needing to say this is the real layer that's truth and the other one is just a fiction, right? But it's kind of in Southeast Asia, there's a sense of everything's kind of not fully fiction, non-fully not fiction, non-fiction anyway. And this is kind of you're almost kind of in this semi dream, and it's not like a stupor, not connected kind of sense, but there's a fundamental sense of even hell isn't forever kind of thing, where holding that lightness allows some of the value of different kinds of parabolic, dreamy kind of ideas and insights to coexist with the space of what we might think of as closer to the heart and the systemic. And maybe these are some of the starting points we can use to think about how this induction without reduction can happen. And the third thing is this idea of what I think of as metaphysical multilingualism. Can we actually have multiple ways of thinking about different kinds of metaphysics and be comfortable translating across these and even operating natively in these, right? So if we ask the question of what are some of the indigenous logics of the socio-imaginational? They could be the nature of socio-imaginational space itself. It could also be, if we're studying Nusantara, what are some of the shadow sensibilities we can discover, which is maybe a very different kind of logic from the scientific logic that we're used to. And if we look at some of these and understand them in their own terms, could that lead us to actually different ideas and maybe physics or science or math for what new systems and protocols and blockchains could look like? We could really expand that imagination, right? In the same way that the discovery of quantum theory and physics actually unlocked a lot of different kinds of innovation, architecture, led to quantum computing, of course, but a lot of other ideas also came out of that, right? And so, if we find a way to really learn to be multilingual across different metaphysical schemes and systems, maybe we'll be able to actually imagine a lot of solutions that we can't, that maybe are not directly imaginable in a linear way, right? There's been people talking about how the idea of consensus and universal truth in modern blockchains actually it's only one set of metaphysics, and that allows you to solve some kinds of problems but maybe not others, and maybe a more quantum or kind of truth that's perspectival kind of blockchain could actually give you very different kinds of solution spaces in a similar way to how advances in math, the discovery of imaginary numbers, allows us to solve different problems from what we could before that. So that's the 4 parts I have for the talk, but I just want to share one small mini preview announcement. If you're interested in a lot of the themes that are here and some of the other ideas from this talk, and I'm actually working on organizing what we call a seapunk festival to explore this reimagination of different futures around Southeast Asia at the intersection of protocols and humanities and social science, different frontiers in tech in the world, new technologies, AI, Web3, but also frontiers and challenges for the world, regeneration, climate, planet, migration, borders, network states, and in the context of Southeast Asia, and trying to say like if some of these sensibilities can actually inform all of these things. The planning's ongoing, but like we'll probably do it sometime around the pop-up village season in Chiang Mai, like later this year. So if you're interested in this, stay tuned. There'll be announcements coming out over the coming weeks or months. And with that, thank you. I don't have a lot of. I'm not very active on social media, but I do have a long, semi-dormant Twitter and a website with some links to my WhatsApp, Telegram, and other things. So with that, I will hand back to Timber. Thank you.
That was great, great, Sam. And I'll kick things off with the Q&A with the master question asker, Venkat, who will spearhead things.
Hi, Venkat. Mute.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Why am I? Okay, there we go. Yeah. This was a little bit mind-blowing. I mean, in our conversations in the last month or so, I think you gave us a little bit of glimpses of the way you were thinking, and I should have known there was a lot more thinking behind it, because like the few things you dropped were like so fertile that it seemed like there was a lot more to be said, and I think even now you've just barely scratched the surface. I think at the workshop you mentioned your definition of punk, which has now become my definition of punk, which is technology without technocracy, and you gave some wonderful examples there. And I think the obvious 2x2 there is a very useful structure to think with, right? Like low technology, low technocracy, high technocracy. And our mutual acquaintance in Singapore, Chua Lee, I think he's also fallen in love with this model now, and I've heard him cite it several times now. So let's make this meme happen. Anyway, so that was. I have several other reactions. A couple of more things I wanted to highlight for other people listening. I think your circle synthesis of like dangerous protocols, punk protocols, good protocols, and then prep is a wonderful sort of like antonym for punk. I think that cycle is actually really useful. And I think, Timber, since you're on the call here, I think this is kind of like an alternative way we can imagine the evolution of protocols that sort of like crosses the boundary of organizations. Like your research was on evolution of safety protocols within an organization, but you can imagine like, even safety protocols, how does it like get punkified when it just penetrates the boundary of the organization? The other one I wanted to highlight was, I think your take on how do you construct the physics of dreams. This is like exactly the mental model we need. Like, how do you like put a protocol under soft sort of like cultural things, like if it's worth doing, and you can have that conversation, but just the mechanics of it, I think that's exactly right. Like a dream physics engine, right? And like I remember Google Deep Dream, before we had all these new image generators that do like very realistic things. The first versions of image generation we had was like dreamlike things. We literally called them Deep Dream, right? And what you're saying reminded me of this interview I watched with Salvador Dali. I put that in the YouTube comments, and somebody was asking him about if his art is dream inspired, and he immediately corrected the interviewer saying, it's not dreams, it's hypnagogic. And hypnagogic is the transition between, waking and dreams. And this, to me, if you like add the social dimension, which you really, I don't know, cleverly introduced as the other dimension. So maybe there's another 2x2 here: sleep versus waking, private versus social, and the boundary between the two. Like you characterize Southeast Asia as a whole region that lives in that zone. And I think your point about like Plato's cave mental model versus like, the shadow theaters of Southeast Asia is like a very good way to get at that. But I think that tradition is also there in the West. You've got KFAB, which is the wrestling, worldwide wrestling thing that does try to like write the boundary between dream and reality, and it has a social dimension. So I think that would be interesting to look at, the KFAB tradition versus Southeast Asian traditional shadow puppetry type of things. But yeah, extraordinarily rich talk, and like I said, a little bit mind blown. So I'm going to be thinking about this talk for a long time. So I guess there was a lot more comments than questions. But yeah, Timber, maybe you have some thoughts too.
I do, but very quickly, we do have one question from the YouTube audience, which is, who is your favorite punk band?
It's I'm not as well versed in punk music as like some of my go-tos are Sex Pistols, but I guess there's probably a lot more that cooler people than me will know about. I did well on my band shirts with this though, so like maybe that buys me a bit of compensation. Yeah.
I think the use of like the Kali Yaga, that phase of the cycle where it's like, okay, the world is now populated with very bad protocols. I mean, at least in my field, we see that a lot in workplace safety, where it's so stale. Every logbook is full of protocols that people don't follow. A popular form of strike is a work to rule. So you follow all the rules that have been set in place to the point where everything comes to a standstill, because there are so many bad protocols in place that they become a attack surface for people. And so not only do they kind of collapse under their own weight, but then you have this work to rule dynamic where I guess if people aren't happy with the situation, they can just directly use the protocols as a weapon.
Yep. And that makes me think of there's been a lot of research people like Jared Diamond have written about like collapse at the grand civilization scale, right? The fall of the Roman Empire, the fall of this, and there's a lot of theories around like how like maybe we're at some similar point of the cycle. That certainly feels true at a macro level, right? We're talking about all the poly crisis and all this kind of like building on the ruins of the unsustainable and all that kind of stuff. But I think there's also it's also true at micro scales, right? Like you're talking about in a body of safety practices within an industry or even a company, right? There's this kind of like naturally as code bases, protocol bases and stuff grow, right? Like if without the right kind of care, they can easily collapse under their own weight, and they pass the point when like they stop being taken seriously, right? And then this is almost kind of like there's this gap between like what people actually believe in practice versus what those institutions are. And I think maybe like I was hinting at, maybe if we're more aware of these cyclical potentials or possibilities, we can better mitigate some of these things at all sorts of different levels. Or I guess some other people would just accelerate some things to bring on the dawn of a new. But that's a whole different talk and conversation. So I just want to add a couple quick responses to Venkat's thing. I think part of between our last conversation and the Datus and Nusas thing and here, I think part of what I was struggling with was how do we do this and talk about all these things without trying to exoticize like something like Southeast Asia, right? Because this talk really isn't about like this region is special and like everyone should be like this and all that kind of stuff, right? But it was like you said, like many other parts of the world, right, actually have long different kinds of aspects of the tradition. It's actually more about like pre-modern, like it's about the two layers, I think, cultures that live more on the realm of like the rich, the indigenous, the story, the socio-imaginational, versus cultures that live on the scientific, institutional, modern, civilizational kind of thing, right? A lot of the struggles within Southeast Asia are actually between like the cities and the bureaucrats versus like the punks of the highlands or the edges or whatever. And we were talking in the workshop about like the group of like German college students, right? That was the archetype. Right, but it struck me that actually Germany, like pre-Prussia, was actually and still remains one of the most decentralized, urban cultures in the world. Right, like it's a lot of bottom-up stuff. Like Berlin's role in Germany is very, very small compared to like let's say that of Paris in France or London in the United Kingdom. Right, that's actually quite a decentralized kind of space. Right, and so like there's I think a lot of really like different history is kind of like different parts progressing at different kinds of rates and how they interact or don't interact. And I think I think the focus of Southeast Asia is partly because we just did this workshop and like there's a lot of Ethereum ecosystem stuff happening over the next few months because of DEF CON and all these other things, right? But like I think there's also a much bigger geography of richness and like a lot of local lessons and cultures that could be unlocked with this.
A quick response to that. I do think yes, there's some of this everywhere in the world, but I do think Southeast Asia does have like if you had like a protocolishness or punkishness scale, I think Southeast Asia would rank higher than Germany. But it's interesting you bring up the German example. So for those who don't have the context of the workshop, we were using the idea of like how do you explain Southeast Asian cultures, sort of like DNA. legibly, and we use the idea of like, how would you explain it to a group of German high school students? And there's some stereotyping going on there where we were like imagining them as the, I guess, prep, since you introduced the term. In our workshop context, we were almost imagining the German high school student as the epitome of prep. But like you said, historically, that's not been true. But you can actually explain Germany's history using your circle diagram, right? Bismarck did the whole political integration project of the little German states into modern Germany, and he was literally a strong man creating good times, something like that. So Bismarck fits in your protocol cycle there. But back to Southeast Asia, you've called it seapunk, and I know in my head I was thinking sea as in ocean, but also sea as in like acronym for Southeast Asia. And there's a reason I think we ended up focusing on Nusantara, which is the maritime Southeast Asian slice of the pie. I think of the three you laid out, seapunk, ricepunk, and mountain punk, I think that is in fact the sort of like dominance hierarchy. It is a region strongly dominated by the oceans first. Next comes rice cultivation, and third comes mountains. And even though James Scott focused on mountains for his sort of like art of being ungoverned, I think that's the sequence. But even though the mountain punk or forest punk or whatever you want to call it is the weakest of the three, in some ways it's also the soul of the three, because you had that picture of the orangutan, right? And if I remember my story correctly, orangutan literally translates to like forest man, right? And the
Man of the forest, yeah. Orang is man, hutan is forest, yeah.
And isn't there a story saying that the orangutans are actually capable of civilization, but decided to stay uncivilized because they were afraid they would be, I don't know, captured and turned into...
Yeah, I think the succinct version is that like they don't speak because if they speak, they'll be forced to work. Yeah, and I've seen that in a few like books and history books, and like I think in our workshop it came out like we weren't sure it was like some sort of passing joke or something, but like again, non-seriousness about it. Is it true? Is it where they come from doesn't matter as much as I think it captures a deeper kind of like sensibility about that region.
And I think that's actually like, even though that folktale really exaggerates the dynamic, you see that in humans all the time. Like I think of it as strategic incompetence. Like I talked about this in some of my blog posts, but in The Office, there's a scene where Ryan, the young hotshot sociopath guy, notices that the microwave is dirty, and he tries to get what's her name? The Pam, yeah. The Pam character to clean it. And she's like, that's not my job. I'm not going to clean the microwave. And why don't you do it? And he says, oh, I'm really bad at that sort of thing, right? So strategic incompetence, as in like pretending you don't have a skill that you actually have. So I wonder if that's like a general protocol punk strategy. Like you're asked to follow protocol, and then you basically credibly claim that you can't because you don't know how. Like not knowing language is like pretending strategic ignorance of a protocol, right? So the orangutans know something.
Yeah, and I think like the fact that so much of Southeast Asia is second language based, not just in English but across other things, right? There's a lot more like looseness and forgivingness and what in a scientific sense you might think of as imprecision, right? But it's a high kind of like leeway and fault tolerance around like language communication because of this, right? And I think it's connected with what makes the region so like so like it is. Right, I think the seapunk is. I think that maybe the sea is a design pattern of sorts. Right, you connect in some ways, but you make other things difficult. The sea made conquest difficult, at least in the age before battleships. Right, and so like, could you design protocols with like some sort of like selective distance kind of attributes that allow certain kinds of bad behaviors to be discouraged and more difficult and all that. Right, so like, can we learn from geography and landscape like mountains and seas as protocol design pattern inspirations?
Yeah, I think that's a good rubric. Like, what does a protocol make easy versus what does it make difficult? And I think that reminds me of like Deleuze and Guattari's smooth versus striated distinction, right? So striated is like what is easy within a protocol, and smooth is like sort of outside the space of the protocol, what becomes hard in the sense of you have to traverse wilderness, but also like freer, because even though it's harder to like navigate the wilderness of the forest, you also don't have to follow the roads or pathways. You can kind of like make your own path. Nobody's telling you have to go down that path. But lots of I'm gonna like share some more thoughts over Telegram with you later. I think there's a lot more to be thought about here.
Cool. Yeah. Welcome any other inputs or questions from like I think my website has my Telegram link as well. If anyone else watching this wants to like say hi.
Cool. And I dropped a link to your website in the YouTube chat so anybody can find it there. Thank you for your time, Sam. That was a really excellent synthesis of a lot of stuff that's being talked about in the SOP circles with punk and protocols. So I'll take you guys out of the stage and I'll say my goodbyes. That was the presentation by Sam Chua, and no formal guest speaker next week, but we have nothing slated in so far, and you can find protocol research on www.summerprotocols.com, as well as a link to the forum there. And we have regular YouTube calls going live here on Wednesdays, so stay tuned for that.